dois, três.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in another session of the CNC meetings. Today, we are going to talk about the loss of wings on ants. Did you know that they brought an evolutionary advantage to ants? That's what we are going to learn, to find out today with our invited speaker, Roberto Keller, from C3C and from the National Museum of Science and Natural History. So our webinar today is entitled "The Loss of Flight in Ant Workers Enabled an Evolutionary Redesign of the Thorax of Foreground Labor." That's what we are going to learn about today. And I thank Roberto for accepting our invitation to give this talk today. I thank you all that are following this session. I also thank Maria Manuela Cincin, professor at the Faculty of Sciences of the University of Lisbon and researcher at C3C, who is also today with us and will say a few words about the work of Roberto. Thank you also for being with us today. And before giving the floor to Maria Manuela Cincin, I'm going to invite you to leave your questions during the session on the live chat that you have on your right on your screen, so that after the presentation, we have a few minutes for Q&A, so we can kindly invite Roberto to answer your questions. So without further delay, I now give the floor to Professor Maria Manuela Cincin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you also to Roberto for agreeing to present some of his work with the collections of the Natural History and Science Museum. He has dedicated much of his work with this collection of insects and especially with ants. And he has developed a very deep and interesting research about the evolution of morphology, also with an implication in the phylogeny of the group. So its basic work is devoted to the collections, which are always an important step for research and for beginning to study any kind of research related with morphology, evolution, or even conservation. So I think that Marta has already said some words about this presentation. And I also want to congratulate Roberto for his very nice work, and I wish the best for this presentation. And thank you also for all and for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Manuela, for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Marta Santos and Mariana Marquez, for organizing these seminars. And let me start by sharing my screen. Okay. So I want to take the opportunity today to talk about the research I have been doing and in collaboration with people from my institution and institutions outside Portugal. As Marta says, I'm going to talk about ants and specifically what makes ant workers a special kind of insect. Now, let me see. So why do we care about ants? So ants are a very popular group of organisms with the general public, but ants are also very special in their biological characteristics. To start with, it's a group that occurs all over the world, excluding the North and the South Pole. They are, like many other insects, they don't tolerate cold conditions very well, but they do occur all over the world and in many different types of ecosystems, dry ecosystem, wet ecosystems. And they are very numerous in terms of species as a group. We have almost 14,000 species described. And just to give you an idea, that's more than double the numbers of known species of mammals. And that's also more than all the numbers of bird species that we have described so far. And an interesting characteristic, of course, especially for ants, is that they are social insects. And not only are ants very numerous in terms of raw numbers of species, but also in terms of the biomass, the amount of just raw mass that they have. So this illustration, what it shows is that if we were to put all the social insects together, and that's not just ants, but also bees, wasps, and other social insects in the world, their biomass would be much more than all the other vertebrates combined. So that's how abundant they are. The day you were able to leave your house and go outside to the park, for example, here in Lisbon, the most common animal you're going to find in the park are not pigeons, are ants, and they're going to be very abundant, and there are many species of them. Now, ants are also very diverse in terms of how they have diverged. It's a group that originated, we estimate, almost 135 million years ago in the Cretaceous, and then radiated immensely. And they occupy very different niche in ecology, so they have very different roles. For example, they can be especially predators, or they can be herbivores, or they can be omnivorous and feeding of all kinds of organic matter. Now, we, as biologists, we try to figure out why are ants so successful ecologically. And of course, one of the key of this success has to be sociality. Sociality in this case entails division of labor. And there are two kinds. So we have reproductive division of labors, where only certain members of the colony will do the reproduction. That's what normally we call the queens. And then we have the workers that do not reproduce, would do all kind of other labors to maintain the colony. Now, there is also, of course, division of labors in the task that each individual worker will do in the colony. Some will specialize in nursing other individuals in the colony, others specialize in going away and looking for food, others specialize, for example, in defense of the colony. And also, something very important about sociality is that there is a cooperative foraging strategy. What this means is that if you are a solitary animal, you procure your own food and eat your food, and that's it. In this case, the whole colony cooperates in looking for sources of food and sharing among colony members. And this is a much more efficient way of getting food from the environment. Now, sociality is not unique to ants. We have many other insects that are social. For example, termites, various groups of wasps and bees. But a difference is that all these social groups are not so numerous in terms of numbers of species and in terms of the ecological success they have. And especially, for example, in the group that comprises ants, wasps, and bees that we term the Hymenoptera, sociality has evolved a dozen times independently, but only in ants we see this great ecological success. So the idea is, what's unique about ants that other also insects don't have that can also tell us something about why ants are so successful ecologically? And one of the things that is unique to ants in compared, for example, to social wasps and social bees is that ants have a caste of adult wingless workers. Okay, so here what we have is, we have normally males that always have wings, but males in social insects, in the case of wasps and bees and ants, they don't really participate in the social structure. It's always, all the colonies are comprised of females, but in females, we have the large queens that are the reproductors of the colony, that are wingless, and they fly at least in certain stage of their life history. But we have the workers that are wingless and comprise most of the individuals in the colonies. And this is a characteristic that is shared across all ants. And we also even have fossil ants that we can see that there are wingless workers. So we know that these characteristics appear in the common ancestor of all ants, and probably it's something that helps explain why ants were able to diversify the way they did. Some of the original hypotheses of what was the reason why ants have wingless workers had to do with the view that because many ants nest in cavities in the ground or they're in different plants, maybe the wings are useful because they are not in the way when they just move around. This hypothesis doesn't hold much weight, also because many other social insects, other wasps and bees, live in small spaces, and the workers all have wings. But what we see with worker ants, something that ants are famous for, is that they are very, really strong insects. And there seems to be insects that are really optimized for the work they do on the ground. And something very peculiar about ants that doesn't occur in any other group of insects is that even though many insects can be very strong, ants workers aren't the only ones that are able to carry heavy loads with their heads on top of their heads, right? And balance these loads. For example, we find that certain flying predators like dragonflies or even some wasps will prey on other large insects, but then they will also grab it with their legs and fly and carry them away by flying. Ants are the only ones that carry things with their head, and they walk on the ground on the trees with these heavy loads. So we wanted, and especially I as a morphology, wanted to understand where is this strength, very peculiar strength, is coming from in ants. Now at this point, I want to give you a very, very quick course on basic ant morphology. And is that in insects, insects are composed of a thorax, of a middle segment that has 3 segments. And each of these segments have 1 pair of legs. No? So all insects have six legs. However, only the second and the third thoracic segment have wings, right? The first thoracic segment has no wings. And that also means that the muscles that will power these wings are only located on the second and third thoracic segments. And this is something that is common to all insects, winged insects. We see it in flies, butterflies, wasps. No? So early on, when I was a postdoc with Patricia Beldade, who is now also at our center in the University of Lisbon, is that when comparing queens and workers, we saw that, as one would expect, because the second segment is the main place where the wings are located, is the biggest segment in the thorax of a flying insect. No? And we see it here in red, what we call a T2, the second segment. And of course, when you look at the workers that doesn't have wings, it's not just the absence of wings, but also that second segment is very much reduced. But something that people have looked at of ant workers, but hasn't really paid much attention and thought much about it, is that the first thoracic segments of the ant workers is very large, is very big. So this is what we turned to our collections to collect data, because we wanted to see how exactly we wanted to quantify this strength. So what we did is we looked for species of ants from various different parts of the phylogeny. So we wanted to sample broadly across phylogeny. And we wanted to sample queens and the workers and measure the length of their thoracic segments to see what sort of trends we could find. And I have to say that this kind of data cannot be collected without collections, because even though workers in collections are very numerous, queens in collections are not so rare, are more rare because they are rarely collected, because there are fewer in the colonies, right? And so when we measure the segments and we compare the ratio of the length of the first thoracic segment versus the second thoracic segment in our different species between queens and workers, we realized that, as we expected, the second thoracic segment in queens was always much larger than the first. And in workers, the first thoracic segment was almost always larger, either equal to the first, but in some cases, extremely larger than that one of queens, right? And then in trying to understand what does these external differences has to do with internal impact, doing dissections, we saw that what we expected is, of course, the queens, most of the thorax is filled by these large wing muscles that are here in red. And all the other muscles in the first thoracic segments are just relegated to the sides because there is not much space left inside the thorax. Whereas in the workers, in the absence of wing muscles, this first thoracic segment is larger, and that also means that all the muscles that are in this first segment are also much larger. And this is significant because the first thoracic segment in insects, what it does is that it forms the articulation with the head. In insects, there are no muscles inside the head that move it in relation to their thorax. So all the muscles that move and lift the head are inside their first segments of the thorax, right? And indeed, at the same time that we were finding this, there was a very nice paper published by a group in the UK where they were trying to figure it out when ants, particularly ants that carry loads that are very elongated and heavy, how do they manage to balance what they are carrying so they can keep the center of mass in a way that they will not tip off. And they will put ants to walk in different surface and different inclinations. And they found out that it's not only strength that the ants need when they are carrying something, but it's very important that they balance their load when they do so they don't tip over. And all the balance is done by the articulation of the neck with the head, right? So not only ants have to be very strong in carrying something, but they have to be very strong by moving and adjusting their load with their heads, right? So for us, that makes sense because that's exactly what we saw. We saw that these muscles that are responsible for moving the head and carry things are the ones that seems to be hypertrophied in the workers in comparison to their queens that have wings, right? Now, when we were analyzing their data, we also find something very curious in that we realized that we have actually two types of queens in relation to the length of the first thoracic segment. We have queens that have a very much reduced first thoracic segment, T1, but there were many species in which queens have an intermediate size between the workers and their queens, because workers always have an enlarged first thoracic segment. So then the moment we saw these differences in species, we wanted to see, of course, to understand these differences in an evolutionary terms. So in order to do that, we enlarge our samples of the difference in the thoracic segment between different queens in different species. And we took the phylogeny that we know we had been reconstructed by other authors using various molecular markers. And we map our characters of the length of the first thoracic segments. And what we found is that a consistent pattern in which having the much bigger or intermediate first thoracic segment in queens is a primitive condition. And all the subsequent appearances of the much more reduced first thoracic segment comes later on, many different times. We also find some reversals on this condition. So in some lineages, some queens have gone from a much reduced first thoracic segment to an intermediate one. Now, of course, doing this kind of morphological mapping on the phylogeny allows to reconstruct how was the ancestor of ants. And of course, we know that because all workers have a very enlarged first thoracic segment, of course, the ancestor of all ants, a worker, will have already a large first thoracic segment. But the question is what type of first thoracic segment queens will have, and our reconstruction suggests that it was an intermediate type of segment, and then the much more reduced one appear later independently in evolution. And so the question is, we have these two types of queens, and what can explain these differences, or what is good for that? And we realize, so analyzing the way the behavior of ants, of queen ants works, is that normally new queens, unmated queens and males are produced by colonies, and then they go out to fly outside in synchronous manner. So the new queens and the new males can meet and mate. And then immediately the queens go to the ground and they shed their wings. And once they do that, there are two strategies that we already have known before. The first strategy is what is called the non-claustral strategy. One second here. What this means is that the queen will start the nest, lay their eggs, but as many other, at this point in their colony founding, it will behave much more like a solitary insect that has maternal care. So what the queen will do is that have the eggs, have the first larvae, but then they will go out and hunt and look for food outside the nest and come back and feed their first generation of workers. Once this worker hatch, the queen no longer leaves the nest and the workers take over. The second known strategy for queens is what we call the claustral type of strategy. What it means is that once the queen shed their wings, they go into the ground and it never leaves the nest. Instead of looking for food outside, the queen has reserves in terms of fat body, and also by consuming its own will muscles, and it's able to feed this new first generation of workers by laying eggs that will not hatch, but they are eggs that are used just for feeding. And this strategy is thought to be evolved because, of course, leaving the nest puts the queen in danger in this very, very crucial part of colony founding, right? So our strategy was to go out and collect data on the type of colony foundation of our queens and see how that matched the morphology we had found. And this was also a difficult type of data to acquire because not often this type of the difference in colony foundation is reported in the literature. But talking about with collecting data from the literature and talking with different researchers specialized in different group of ants, we were able to collect most of the data for when ants are non-claustral, when ants are claustral, and there are even cases where sometimes, depending on certain ecological conditions, the queens can either forage outside or stay inside the nest, right? And when we map the behavior in our tree in correlation with our morphology, we realize that at least in 2 times during evolution, the behavior of going from non-claustral to claustral match the reduction in the size of the first thoracic segment. There are cases in which that wasn't the case. So there is a change in morphology without changing in behavior. Now, other previous authors have already suspected that the non-claustral behavior was ancestral and then the claustral behavior evolved later. But this is the first time we formally tested this assumption using a phylogeny and a formal way of mapping characters in evolution. So we were able to confirm that this is most likely the case, right? Now, so doing that, we are able to establish that the common ancestor of ants, the queens, was a type of queens that have a intermediate size of first thoracic segment, and that was a non-claustral founder. And that claustrality evolved later on. So why does this correlation happen? So the hypothesis here is that when the queen that is not claustral is in their colony foundation stage, that queen will also have to go out and hunt for food. So having these greater muscles of the head that allows them to carry weight and hunt will be beneficial for it. Once the queen goes claustral, it no longer hunts at any stage of the lifetime. It no longer does any kind of this behavior that requires the strength that we see in workers. So, and instead of that, the queens will optimize their wing muscles because they will be used for reserve to feed their colony. So that's why we maybe see this reduction in the first thoracic segment and enlargement of the second thoracic segment. Now, in cases where we didn't find a match between the queen behavior and the morphology, we can give good explanations of why this can be the case. For example, in this group, this clade over here, where the queens seems to have a small first segment but no claustral, these are a group of ants that specialize in eating the eggs of other insects. So in this photograph here, these eggs you see here are not ant eggs, they are eggs from spiders. So basically what this queen will do is that when they are looking to find a new colony, they'll find a spider nest and nest in the spider nest and consume the eggs. So they are not claustral in the formal definition of the word because they don't use their reserves to rear the first generation, but they don't need to go out and forage. So maybe that's a reason why they lose this strength related to the neck muscles. No? Other cases, we really don't have data on the behaviors because there are ants that are rarely collected. So at this stage, we still don't know. But there are, of course, one power of this type of analysis is that it points to places that will be interested to go and see what's going on with the behavior. So it's also a way of directing research toward interesting questions. So at this point of our study, one of our conclusions was that, yes, workers are not simple wingless versions of queens that are smaller, but they seem to be optimized for the type of work they do on the ground. And also that we have two categories of queens, and they seem to be related with the type of behaviors. Their morphology seems to be related with the type of behaviors they do. Now, our next step in the project was, especially for me as a morphologist, I wanted to really figure out this difference in the morphology. How does this impact the strength that workers have? So I wanted to answer the question from an anatomical and morphological perspective of how can ant workers be so strong, right? And in order to do that, we team up with the Biodiversity and Biocomplexity Unit at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. This is a group led by Evan Economo. And this is an amazing team of scientists that they work on many aspects of ecology. They use different type of organisms, but they do specialize in ants. And something that this unit is very good at is applying cutting-edge technology to ecological and morphological problems. So what they were able to offer in our collaboration was to use X-ray microtomography to look really at the morphology in a way that we couldn't do it before. Now, for those not familiar with this technique, microtomography, in this case, what is called micro CT, is a technique where you have a machine. In this machine is similar to the ones they have at that institute, but there are many types of ways of generating X-rays for this type of work, where you put your sample, your little ant, in a stage, goes in the machine where there is a source of X-rays and there is a detector. And basically what you do is that you put your sample, and the sample will rotate and take image from many different angles. So it's a technique that is called tomography, similar to the tomography that maybe many people are familiar with because of the magnetic resonance that is done when in medicine is used to look, for example, at the brain. You know? And what these techniques allows is that, in this case, like an X-ray, allows to look at the inside of the body without having to destroy the sample. And the data looks very much like an X-ray that we have seen, with the difference is that in a regular X-ray, you see everything in a photograph. So you see all the different organs and parts of the body on top of each other. But because in this case, we have volumetric information, we have the information about where things occur in space. When we see a slide of an organism, we just see exactly what type of structures we have inside in this very thin slide. And also we can see our data in any plane. So we can look at as a satellite plane in profile, or we can see transversely. And of course, like I'm showing this reconstruction, you can reconstruct a 3D version of your sample and look through it. Now, the data is data that comes in terms of like an X-ray. It's just different intensities, and we represent it as grayscale, right? But something very powerful is what is called segmentation. This is when you go to your data and you can assign the different, in this case, they are not pixels, but voxels, so it's volumetric pixels. You can assign them to different values to do artificial coloring of them. And for that, of course, you need to know anatomy. So you need to know what you're looking at. And then you can create these three-dimensional renderings that not only show the surface, but then you can go inside and differentiate the muscles and the other parts that you are interested in. So for example, the muscles that move the mandibles, the brain, and
Roberto, I'm sorry. Roberto, we are not listening. Roberto? Roberto? Roberto, I'm sorry, we are not listening to you. There's some bad contact in your phones. Can you please just speak so that we can see if we are listening to you? We are just trying to solve this technical issue very shortly. So let's just wait a few seconds. Yes. Perhaps you could try to talk, but we are not listening yet. Not yet. Let's just wait a few seconds and we'll solve this shortly. Not yet, no. I'm not sure if you're hearing me. No. Not yet. No, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. No.
Sorry for
No.
the
Everything's fine. So we just stopped listening from the very last part of the previous slide. So you were finishing explaining the colors of the different muscles, and that's when we finished hearing you. Thank you.
Okay, sorry for the hiccup. So I was explaining a powerful thing about this technique is that one can take these images that are grayscales, and then knowing the anatomy, you can assign values to the different voxels. So then you can create these very nice to visualize internal views of the muscles and all the cuticle and all the skeleton that you want to see. And that's very useful to understand what's going on. And it's also very useful to discuss and analyze the data, and also to communicate the data to, especially to our colleagues or the public in general, when you can have these very complex morphologies that then become very easy to understand. So for our specific project, we choose 2 different species that are extreme in the morphology that we were interested in. One is a species that represent these workers in which the queens are not claustral. And also important is that the difference in morphology between the queen and the worker is not very large. It's really just the wings, but the size of them are very similar. And also, this is a type of workers that are very, very stout, very strong workers. They are predators of other insects. They have a very powerful sting. And our species was on the other extreme, on the phylogeny. And this is a species where the queens are claustral, and the queens are much larger than the workers that are smaller. It's more the typical ants that you will encounter in the park when you go to a picnic. And also the ants of this particular species are very agile. They're very, they run around not this particular species we use, but these species of this genus, for example, are found here in Portugal. If you go to the Alentejo, and they will be running around like crazy during midday, right? So we went out and applied micro-CT techniques to these different species, and we wanted to compare the queens and the workers and do comparison between the 2 queens and the 2 workers and the 2 different species, right? Now, what we find out is something that we were expecting, is that, of course, in a queen, in both of the queens, the wing muscles that here are painted in violet and purple take much of the space of the thorax. But I wanted to show you something very peculiar, is that even though these muscles relate only to the second thoracic segment, the second thoracic segment in insects have these projections inside the thorax that invade the first thoracic segment and go out and invade the back of the thorax. So really all the thorax of flying insects is taken over by the huge wing muscles. What this means is that the muscles in red here that, for example, are related to articulation of the head, and the muscles that are related to the articulation of the back of the abdomen are really, really squeezed and relegated to the sides, right? So we were expecting, when you compare a queen and a worker, in this case of our species of Cataglyphis, you realize that yes, in the absence of these huge wing muscles, all the muscles that have to do with the articulation of the head are just enlarged. They just have much more space to grow larger, and also to take different angles of attack through the head, right? And but also interesting is that insects in general will have in each segment these cuticular structures that rise up, and there are muscles that go from the head to these different pillars, right? And what these muscles do is that they not so much give strength or lift to the pieces, but they serve as a way to transmit force from one part of the insect to the back. So you can think of this as a way of a suspension bridge, right? Where these blue parts, these cuticles are the pillars, and then the muscles serve as this tension bridge, right? And what we see in the workers is that all these muscles, in the absence of the wing muscles that are normally on the way, these pillars and these muscles can grow larger and give much more support to the head and to the abdomen, right? And this is important because ant workers not only will be carrying things with their head, but they always maintain their gaster, of course, horizontally. Something that if without the tension from these muscles, they will be dragging their abdomen on the ground. So it's important not only to be able to carry things with your head, but also carry your abdomen, right? So when we compare our queens and our workers in the two different species, we see this pattern of how all the space that is free from the wing muscles is taken over by other muscles. And this particular slide, I want you to pay attention to these muscles that are here colored in orange, because these are very special muscles. These are muscles that originate inside the cavity of the thorax, but they insert inside the legs. And basically what these muscles do is that when they contract, they push the legs down, and that means they are the muscles responsible for lifting the body off the ground, right? So they are not the muscles that move the legs for walking, but they are the muscles that makes the whole body of an insect stay above the ground, right? And what we realize is that these muscles in workers, in the absence of these large wing muscles, they are much more larger, and they can reach all the way to the top of the body. So they are not only larger and have more volume, but they can also pull the weight of the whole ant from a more advantageous side. So in the queens, for example, in these species, these muscles have to come from the side to give room for the wing muscles. But in the workers, they can take over all the center, right? And you can see also that there is some difference because of the different type of workers. So in the species where they are very stout and very strong, and they have a very tough abdomen, the muscles above the abdomen are very large. And our species that is a very gracile runner, the muscles of the legs are very elongated. So that's also, that makes sense. It correlates with their behavior, right? You can see it here. This huge abdomen is carried by these huge muscles, and these long legs are powered by these very large muscles in these type of workers. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time, here is a graph where we can see what I just told you in a quantitative way. We are just plotting here the proportion of different muscles in the thorax related to the volume they take from the thorax. And we can see the strength where normally, for example, for certain muscles of the neck, the workers will always have larger, much more volume than their queens. And for example, in the case of this first species, of course, the muscles are always larger for the ones that carry the abdomen, where in the species that are runners, especially in the workers, the muscles that move the legs are the ones that take over a large volume of the empty thorax, right? So in conclusion, we find out that yes, the evolution of flight workers means that these individuals specialize really and for activities in four legs, right? So it was not only the losing flight, but also specializing for now being runners, right? Insects that live on the ground. And we were able to identify at least 5 points important in the morphology of the workers that explains why workers are so strong. So one is that without the need for a thorax that have wings and fly, the thorax, the plates of the thorax can fuse together, so becomes a more rigid box. And that means that the muscle have a very surface of attachment that is more rigid and sustain larger muscle stress. And of course, there is an enlargement of the muscles of the neck that will explain how ants are able to carry weights and balance this weight. And also we find the difference in the muscles that move the legs, that is called the trochanter muscles. And of course, the muscles to flex the abdomen. And a conclusion of this study is that even though we normally focus on sociality and division of labor and cooperative foraging to explain the success of ants, it's also important to look at the individual features of the members of the colony and to try to understand how each of the pieces also have specialization that can explain why they can be so successful ecologically. And this work couldn't be done without division of labor and cooperative research. So I want to thank all my collaborators during these years and the institutions and funding that have supported me. And if you like this talk, like and subscribe to the channel. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for this very, very interesting talk. You really took us on a journey to learn more about ants, and really congratulations for this work. It's really interesting, and I'm not going to look at ants at the same way. So now when I go on the street and I see ants, I'm going to think about your talk and about what I learned here today. So thank you. And it's not just my words. You have several comments here on the live chat congratulating you on the amazing presentation and beautiful images that you also shared with us.
Thank you very much.
So
thank you, everybody.
And we have some questions already on the YouTube live chat. So I'm going to start with the first one. 2 questions from one of your collaborators, Patricia Beldade. So I'm going to start with the first question. I think you mentioned some aspects that need and briefly answer this question, but I'm not sure if you want to add or elaborate a little bit more. So the first question is, are there differences in morphology or age or other factors between workers responsible for different tasks? This is in relation to the division of labor between individual workers that you've mentioned.
Okay. Hi, Patricia. So, so division of labor in workers can occur in 2 ways. One is, as Patricia maybe mentioned in the question, has to do with the age of the workers. So, for example, workers that are younger, adult, will more normally stay in the nest and tend nurse. It will be nursers. And workers that are older, so the older ladies, are the ones that risk their life and go out and hunt. Now, in these cases, as far as we know, there are no morphological differences, right? So these are more behavioral changes that happens during the lifetime of an individual. But the other division of labor is when it's more hard-coded. So it's not the software, but the hardware. And that's where you find these different castes. So for example, soldiers that are specialized for defense, it can be active defense, meaning they have special mandibles and strong heads to crush invaders, or it can be passive ways of defending. For example, soldiers that their heads will be shaped like a block. So ants living in nest cavities will block their entrance of the nest with their own heads, right? So in these cases, there is differences in the hardware and in the software that amount to difference in their division of labor.
Thank you, Roberto. And following now with the second question by Patricia that goes, continuing this question, which is, Any idea how much inter-individual variation within task there is for muscle mass, and whether that is due to genetic differences versus nutritional plasticity?
Yeah, so something I didn't mention in the talk because of time is that another very interesting factor about castes in ants is that the difference are mainly due to developmental plasticity, right? And nutrition, for example, which is something that will make them be of different castes, also, I mean, plays a large role. And within a colony, even when we don't find big difference in caste between, for example, workers and soldiers, within a colony, we do find a large variation of different sizes of workers. And something very interesting is that even when we don't find discrete castes in the workers will difference in size and also will have different allometric relationship between their body parts, right? So for example, workers that are larger tend to have proportionally much larger heads. Now, so this variation, for example, in the size of the head and the different part of the body, there is a lot of studies. Now, how this external variation impacts muscle mass, we really don't know. The general assumption is that the bigger the plate we see outside, like a skeletal plate, the difference we see inside. Now, something I don't think is well known in, or I don't know the answer in insects, is how much, for example, certain activity during the lifetime will influence the building up of muscles or not. In the way, for example, we know it occurs in vertebrates, right? So during the lifetime, or even in us, in people can go to the gym and exercise and change their mass volume in muscles, and even change the configuration of their bones. I don't know in insects how that works, so can answer that question.
Thank you. I will, there's a comment by Patricia, and I will say that comment and also add another question that we have from Mario Boyai. So I'll merge the two. So one of the comment/question by Patricia is, doesn't muscle mass reduce with age? And following to the question, so you can address both. Mario Boyeiro starts by thanking you for your presentation, and then he says, many ant species are social parasites of other phylogenetically related species. For example, Temnothorax, Russell marmex, and I hope I pronounced it right. So the question is, do you know how are related the morphological differences in body form between these close related species, but with different ecology, like slave makers, parasites, and their hosts?
Yeah. So thank you for the question. So, for example, in the case of Temnothorax, so these are queens that will, when they found in a colony, they will look for the nests of species of the same genus, and then enter the colony. And I don't remember exactly if this is the case of Temnothorax, but very often this parasite will kill the queen of that colony and take over, right? And they make the workers of the host colony to work for them. I know that in the case of Temnothorax, the difference, for example, in the thorax is not large. So the Temnothorax queens looks very similar to the way the Temnothorax queens of the host colony will look like. But for example, other cases, like there is these ants called that some people call it kidnapped ants. So what they do is that they will look for other colonies, and they will enter the colony, kill all the adults, and steal their brood, and they rest their brood as they run. So when they hatch, they recognize the parasitic colony as they run, let's say. That's a very interesting case because the queens of that the species that are normally predated or taken over, the queens will have a very small T1, right? But the queen of this other parasitic species, even though it's closely related, does have a larger T1. And the mandibles are also specialized for killing the adults, right? So we do see that in these cases, even in close related species or lineages, sometimes even the queens will change the morphology in relation to the type of behavior they do, no? So this does happens in certain parasites. And in the general matter, there are many other species, case of parasitic queens in which they have a very strange morphology. They really look like they are halfway cooked in a way. They look very weak. So you can really, and they are wingless and all these things. So they really, like many other parasites in many other cases in other organisms, the morphology is really reduced once they become parasites. So there is really a nice correlation between parasitic behavior and changes in morphology.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. And we have one question, which I would say maybe the last one because we are arriving the lunchtime, but we have a final question by Eduardo Marabuto. He asks, and what about the drones? Will their morphology be like queens? As they are mostly short-lived, will there be the intermediate type altogether?
So drones, males in ants, so normally they're, and it's very interesting because their morphology looks very much like you'll find a wasp, right? Or it more bit similar to the queens with a small T1. Drones, of course, don't, kissing ants, they don't do much work. However, there are few cases in ants where males, they have species where there are two types of males. There's the regular type of males that have wings. So when they hatch, they go out of the nest and look for queens to mate. But sometimes you have males that are wingless and they stay inside the nest. And what these males do is that they fight with each other. So they fight among brothers in order to be able to mate with newly emerged queens. And these males have a large T1 similar to the workers. So in these males that have a behavior where they are really using their head to do, in this case, fight, their first thoracic segment is also very strong. And these two different males are also have been proved to be a case of developmental plasticity. So one can even experimentally induce the difference between these two males by applying or hormone analogs during development, and you get these males with wings and a reduced first thoracic segment, or this male without wings and a large first thoracic segment. So in males, this can happen as well.
Thank you, Roberto. And I would say that it's now time for us to wrap up the session. Thanking you once again for your amazing presentation. It really leaves us thinking and looking at that differently. And I'm sure that there will be several lines of research now in the future following these works, and we will continue following the updates on this research. Thanking also everyone that attended it and that is following this session. Thank you for your presence, for your participation, for your questions. Please stay tuned for future events. And thanking also Mariana Marques, who is here on the backstage, ensuring that everything goes well here between Zoom and YouTube. Thank you, Mariana. Thank you all for attending, and please stay tuned for next events, next seminars in the following week.